Well, good afternoon. This is Dr. Kremens again on this snowy Chicago afternoon. I hope that it's not too bad where you are. It's actually pretty cold and pretty snowy here, and I've already shoveled at least once today. We'll probably have to do another round tonight. So before I do that, I wanted to share some basic editing suggestions with you for the first paper as you're thinking about it, as you're working on it, as you're drafting it. Some of you have already asked good questions about it or sent me preliminary drafts that I've taken a look at. So, if you have any other questions, please let me know. And what I've done is on Blackboard, I've posted a sort of an overview of some common errors, not only in English 102, but also in English 101. So those of you that had me for 101 will probably recognize some of these examples. I tend to use them in both classes, although I put them in a slightly different order for 102. Just to emphasize different aspects of the papers that I want you to work on. So the sheet that I put up on Blackboard, I think of it as a sort of a checklist, basically, a sort of checklist that you can use to go over your paper before you turn in the final version of it to me, so that you can check on some of the basic style and grammar issues. Now, as we go forward over the course of the semester, I'll add things to this list. I'll come up with other sheets like this one that you'll have up on Blackboard, just so that I can have you focusing on different aspects of your papers. And one thing I should also mention is that this first one is very basic and very straightforward. So a lot of this will be a review of material that you probably did in 101 or in whatever the last English class was it is that you took. So we're going to go through this, and again, if you have any questions on these, let me know. I'm using Zoom, which is why the quality is probably a little less than when I'm shooting on my iPhone, so that I can do a screen share. So I want to be able to go through some of these ideas with you. And as I always mention, if you have any questions, please let me know. So let me do the screen share of this handout that I will put up on Blackboard for you. And so what you're going to see here, again, are some really basic, well, there's the assignment itself. Let me go to the right one here. So this is what I call a grammar style review. Let me enlarge the sheet here a little bit. And again, these are very basic, very, very straightforward things that I'm sure you've heard a bunch of times and that you're familiar with. But I think it's always good to review, particularly this early in the semester. So you look at some of these small errors that sometimes crop up in your papers, and that I'll correct. Now, other thing I want to mention before I just briefly go through these is that I'm not going to fail anyone if you have a strong paper with strong ideas. Otherwise, then you've got these little errors. I want you to be aware of them. Excuse me, because the further you get with your writing, these are the little things that you want to be aware of and that you want to watch for. A well-edited paper will eliminate most of these errors. It's really not possible unless you have superpower somehow to correct every single one of these errors. That's why professional writers have editors. When I was working on my first book, there were at least 3 different editors that worked on it with me and helped me with checking on typographical mistakes, any kind of grammar errors or anything like that I might have made and that I might have slipped up on. So again, excuse me, it's difficult often to edit your own writing. And so one thing I want you to keep in mind as you're working on your essays is they're not going to be perfect. You're not going to catch all these mistakes. And I do also want you to reach out for help. Either ask me for help, or you can make an online appointment with the Writing Center to check some of these little errors. But you want to make sure that you're looking for them and that you're trying to make your sentences as strong as you can. So let me just go through some basic elements here, some of which are going to be obvious, some of which maybe it'll jog your memory about some of these issues. So first off, this is not a grammar or style issue, but one thing I always mention is that before you start on a paper, please make sure that you've not only done the readings for it. So for paper number 1, you're reading Farwell by Diebeck, but also make sure you read the directions. As I mentioned in one of my earlier videos, I do give fairly detailed directions, and I do that so that when you're sitting down and you're writing the paper, I'm hoping that they serve as a kind of a safety net for you so that you have a suggested structure, you sort of know what's being asked for. The other videos that I've done, or the other video that I did for paper number 1 with the suggested outline, also serves that purpose, because I want you to make sure that you have a good sense of the overall structure of the paper. But again, make sure that you ask me as well. But again, my directions are fairly detailed, so they're going to give you a lot of information and a lot of suggestions if you look them over carefully before you start working on the paper. And again, I know that sounds obvious, but you'd be amazed at how many times I'll have a student who will start working on a paper, and it's clear to me from reading the draft that they probably haven't looked at the directions yet. And I'll say, well, did you look at the directions? And they'll say, no, I know you mentioned we were writing on Stuart Diebeck, so I just started working on it based on what I saw in your video, or when I'm in the classroom, based on what we talked about in class. But read those directions again. That's what they're there for. They're there to help you, and they also will answer your questions on structure and the font that I want you to use. So that's all in there. And if anything's not clear, please let me know and I'll be happy to help. Now for quotation marks and italics, again, I'll correct these. I'm not going to fail anyone for a paper if they do these wrong, but I do want you to be aware of these rules that we follow. So first of all, any works that are short, so that would include essays, essay titles, poem titles, short story titles like Farwell, song titles. Anything that's a short piece of work, an article title, for example, should be placed in quotation marks. And so I've given an example here in this first sample sentence of a favorite album of mine and a favorite song. Now, an album or a mixtape, I don't know if that's what they're called these days, that's considered a longer work. So any longer works like newspaper titles, magazine titles, book titles, as I said, album, CD titles, mixtapes, whatever, any longer works have to have their titles italicized. Okay, so here's an example sentence. My favorite track from Van Halen's 1986 album 5150, notice the italics, that's the name of the record, is the song, quote, Best of Both Worlds, end quotation marks. Okay, so you'll notice here, the album, is called 5150 and it's italicized. And then the song is called Best of Both Worlds and that's in quotation marks. All right, you'll also notice, and I correct this as well, and again, I'm not going to fail anybody for this, but in American usage, in US usage, we place periods and commas inside quotation marks, okay? And if you were writing, for a British class, if you were taking a class in the UK, if you were taking a class in any former colony of the United Kingdom that uses their rules, they do place commas and periods outside quotation marks, but in our usage in the US, we don't do that. We place periods and commas inside quotation marks. So if you get a paper back from me and you notice that I keep correcting that and I keep putting your periods inside the quotation marks, that's what I'm doing. And that's correct usage in the US. It might be in all North America, I'm not really sure. I don't know if the Canadians, put their periods outside quotation marks or not. I'd have to ask Canadian friends of mine. But in the US usage, that's how we place the periods inside. So you'll see that here. That's correct, okay? Now, the next one is another sample like that. But let me just read this last sentence. This is another good example. Again, you're going to see the title of the New York Times, a newspaper, and then you're going to see a title of an article from the New York Times, and you'll see how they're punctuated slightly differently. So it says here, I read several articles from the New York Times, again, italics, because it's a longer work. It's a newspaper with a bunch of different smaller articles in it. And so it says, I used the New York Times to research this paper. That title of the newspaper would be in italics. It says, I learned a lot from an article titled, What's Nostalgia Good For? Written by John Tierney. Again, What's Nostalgia Good For? Is the title of the article. It's a short piece of work. It's not as long as a book or as a whole newspaper or as a whole magazine. And so you're putting it in quotation marks. All right, so those are just some examples of that, just to keep in mind, so that I also give you these now so that if I do correct these, you'll know what I'm correcting. You can refer back to this, when you can later in the semester. Now, run-ons and sentence fragments, again, you can read some of these on your own. A run-on sentence, also called a comma fault, is where you have multiple separate sentences that have all been squashed together into one long sequence, and they need to be separated because each one has different subjects and verbs and different ideas. So let me read this example. Some of you from my one-on-one class may remember this sample from last semester. Here it says, when I read Susan Sontag's essay on photography, I realized that I take too many pictures while I'm on vacation. I take these photos because I want to remember the trip. My mom always thinks I take too many photos, and as Sontag suggests, I know I should take time to enjoy the moment itself. I'm gonna take a drink of water after that. That's a classic example of a run-on sentence, which is technically not even a sentence at all. When I learned these, it was actually called a comma fault. take a drink of water here and I'll read the corrected examples of that. Okay, so how do we split that up? Now, typically I see these run-on sentences at the 102 level, sometimes in thesis statements, sometimes when you're trying to make a lot of points. So you want to make sure you divide it up. Now that's at least 3 or 4 separate ideas in one there. So here's how it would read. If you take a look at this, I have it here. When I read Susan Sontag's essay on photography, I realized that I take too many pictures while I am on vacation. So there's that first period. There's a pause there. You want that idea to sink in for the reader. Then you go to the next one. I take these photos because I want to remember the trip. However, my mom also thinks I take too many photos. As Sontag suggests, I know I should take time to enjoy the moment itself. So you'll see that's now been split up into 4 separate sentences, each one distinct, each with its own subject and verb. So the best way to identify that, and one thing I was taught when I was first learning some of these grammar and style rules, is you can read it out loud like I did, right? I tried to read that first example where there were no periods, and it was difficult to read because there's no pauses, there's no breaks at all. So it's hard to even, it's hard to read it to begin with. So if you feel like there's maybe a problem where you have a run-on sentence, read it out loud. You'll hear it. You'll hear that it's going on for too long, and then you can figure out where those pauses would be, where the periods would be placed in order to break up the ideas. Because again, you want to, writing is a lot like writing an essay is like writing a piece of music or being a musical performer. You can control the pace at which the listener, for example, or the reader gets the information. If you want to slow the reader down, then you want to use sentences that are broken up by periods where the ideas are done very gradually, one idea after the other. Once you take a bunch of periods out of something, it creates a kind of rapid kind of reading because there's no periods or sometimes even commas to kind of slow you down and to give you those pauses. So when there's no punctuation in something, the reading experience can seem really quick. And that's not necessarily a good thing because your ideas that are not coming across distinctly to the reader. So you want to sort of slow down with your writing and listen to where those breaks are. Imagining that you were presenting it as a speech, for example, and by slowing it down, you're going to get those ideas across to the reader one after the other after the other. Okay, so you can control really the speed at which the reader reads what you're writing, and that can be very important in any type of writing, not just creative writing, but in this kind of academic writing. You really want to control the rhythm of the sentences. Again, I think of these things in kind of musical terms like that. Now, a sentence fragment, as you probably know, is the opposite. That's where you don't have complete sentences and they've sort of been joined together. I'll give another example here in this next one. It says, Susan Sontag's essay on photography discusses different kinds of photos and the effect these photos can have on the memories of those that take them. Now, the second half of this is not a complete sentence. That's a fragment. It doesn't have a complete subject and verb agreement in it. So if you look at the corrected version, you'll hear the difference of it. Again, when you read it out loud, here it says, the first thing I do when I sit down to write a paper is to make an outline. And excuse me, this is another error one. So I'll read this one again, then we'll read the corrected ones on the next page. The first thing I do when I sit down to write a paper is to make an outline of my thoughts so that I can keep my essay organized. Again, that second part is not a complete sentence. Let's look at the corrections here real quick. Here's the corrected version of the photography sentences. Susan Sontag's essay on photography discusses different kinds of photos and the effect these photos can have on the memories of those that take them. In this case, what I did is I took that mistake and I combined it into one sentence because those ideas are related anyway. So there's no reason to use that period to split up ideas that are so closely connected and really belong together in the same sentence. Next one, I did separate into 2 separate sentences because I wanted that pause. I wanted that effect on the reader. So here it says, the first thing I do when I sit down to write a paper is to make an outline. I make an outline of my thoughts so that I can keep my essay organized. Now you'll notice why that period needs to be there because the first sentence is talking about the fact that the person makes an outline before they actually write their paper. Second part of it, though, is a separate idea. I make an outline of my thoughts so that I can keep my essay organized. The first one is telling us that this writer makes the outline. The second sentence is telling us that they do that in order to keep organized. Those are separate ideas. And so in the first example of that, this second half is not complete enough to be able to give that impression and that idea to the reader. So again, it's all a matter of what you want to get across to the reader, how fast you want them to read your ideas, what pace at which you want them to read it. And also, again, you want those complete sentences, that subject-verb agreement, because if you don't have that, in the case of fragments, you're going to have choppy ideas, and they're not going to flow. In the case of the first one, the run-ons, you're going to have places where it's hard to follow the ideas because they're coming so rapidly that it's hard to keep track of them. Now, again, in English 102, I don't see as many of these issues. When they do come up, often they're just typos, they're simple mistakes, and they're, as you can see, they're fairly easy to correct. So if you have any questions on these, please let me know. And again, I want you to have examples in front of you so that when I give a paper back, when I give paper number 1 back, for example, and I've graded it, and I mentioned that maybe you need to work on run-on sentences or fragments, you'll have an example of what they are and how to correct them, okay? So next one, number 4, very simple. This is a typo that I see more often in 101, but occasionally it does happen in 102. Remember, the pronoun I is used for the subject of a sentence. So this is actually incorrect in formal writing. Me and my sister loved going to our Aunt Judy's house for Christmas. That's fine if you're writing informally, if you're writing a text to someone or an email, but for a formal essay, like most of the ones you're writing for this class, you would say, my sister and I loved going to our Aunt Judy's house for Christmas. Again, I is used in the subject of a sentence, not me. Me would always be used at the end or in the object of a sentence, okay? Next couple, and I'm getting towards the end of this list here for the first couple of papers that we'll be working on. Try to read over your draft as carefully as you can. If you're like me and you need someone else to read your writing to make sure that you've caught all the typos, if you can find someone, maybe a friend, family member that you can send it to, just have them give it a once over. Again, it's very, very difficult to edit one's own writing, especially if you've been working on it for a long time. You start to lose objectivity, you start to lose your place with it. And so I always recommend asking for help. Again, you can send me a draft and I can take a look for any little typographical errors that you might have. You can make an appointment with the Writing Center online. They would be happy to work with you and give you suggestions. But just read over the paper before you turn it in, before you turn in the final version of it, as carefully as you can, because you're going to find on your own either small errors or small typos, or again, if you give it to someone else, they're going to find some of those small errors, right? And then lastly, these two, number 6 and number 7, we're going to get into more of this with paper number 2. Paper number 2 is where we're using more sources, and you'll see that assignment shortly. It's going to focus more on Dieback and Otto Binder, the next writer that we're getting into. So for the first paper anyway, let me just go over some very basic elements of MLA format. And MLA stands for Modern Language Association. That's the group of English professors that make these rules for citing things and also for manuscript format. So, for example, I have a membership that I need to renew, actually, now that I think of it, to the MLA. So most of your English professors are probably members of the Modern Language Association. There's a conference every year, and they also come up with some of these rules, or they update these rules every few years. So for most of the papers that we're going to write, you're going to have either electronic sources, sources that are online, or you're going to have book sources or things that have been copied from book sources. For example, like Farwell. Farwell, I scanned from The Coast of Chicago, Stuart Dieback's first book of short stories. And that's why you'll see it's got page numbers at the bottoms of the scan, because I've scanned it from this book. Or actually, excuse me, in the case of this book, the page numbers are at the top of the pages. So when you're citing Dieback, this is an example sentence that you can use. And there's also example sentences like this on the directions. I think they're not on Dieback. It's just a generic paragraph that shows you how to use a book source. But let me read this one that uses an example from Dieback's Farwell. So it says here, when the narrator notices the map over Babovich's desk in the story, he wonders why it has so many red circles on it. Babovich explains that those are all locations of, quote, good bakeries. Now you'll notice that's a direct quotation from the story. It appears on page 5, and we'll know that because, again, on your scan, you're going to see that, in the case of, again, I took it from this copy of the book. So at the top of the page, you see page 5, and then you put his last name and you put the page number. That's all you need to include when you're using a book source that has page numbers and you're citing things from it. You're showing the reader where you got this information from, so that if they wanted to, they could look it up too. I mean, that's one of the reasons that we do these citations. When I'm quoting someone, for example, in an article that I'm writing, I'm assuming that my reader is probably going to want to know where I got that information from. They might want to look it up themselves to do their own research. So they need to know where to find it. And that's why we have this kind of formatting. And now in this case, it's just the last name of the author and the page number. And you'll notice too, the period comes at the end of the sentence. That's another MLA rule. When you have an example like this, the period doesn't appear before the parentheses. It actually moves to the very end of the sentence. All right. Now, this is not going to be relevant for paper number one because all you're using is Diebeck, and you could include maybe one quotation in the last paragraph as you compare your map and its elements to the map that Babovich has of those bakeries on his wall from his home city of Odessa in Ukraine. But we will have some online electronic sources as we go forward into the next few papers. So when you're using an online source, they very, very rarely are going to have page numbers unless they're digital scans of existing books, like this one. So all you need is the last name of the author. And I'm going to use an example that some of you may remember from 101 last semester, one of the essays that we did, because it's an online essay by Evelyn Glennie called Hearing Essay. So here's an example. This is an online essay that she wrote for her website a few years ago. And so if I had a quotation like this, here's how I would cite it in MLA format. She explains in Hearing Essay that in her opinion, hearing is basically a specialized form of touch. Now again, this is a direct quotation taken from Glennie's online essay. There are no page numbers. So to cite it, all you've got to do is put in her last name in the parentheses. That's it. Now, are there exceptions to this? Yes, there's some other technical rules that I don't want to go into at this point because I don't want to confuse anyone, and I want to keep it as straightforward as I can this early on. So if you know some of those other rules or you were taught them in 101 about examples where you would change, you might not even have the page number at all at the end of the sentence, or you'd only have the page number. Those are important rules too, but for right now, I just want you to focus on these two so that you don't get too confused about the different variations on these rules. So remember, for a book source that has page numbers, when you're citing it, all you need is the last name of the author and the page number. If it's an electronic source that does not have page numbers, then you just need the last name of the author, okay? And you can read this on your own. I've also shown you examples here of how to include a book source in your works cited, a book like Coast of Chicago. That's also on your directions, by the way, for paper number one, so you can take a look at that. I've given you a sample works cited at the end of the directions. And then here's an example of an electronic source. You'll notice it does include the web address, the URL for the actual website where it's included. And again, that's not relevant for paper number one because all we're using is the story from this book. So we're not using any electronic sources yet. But as we go forward, we're going to use them. So I want you to have that practice. And before I mention one last thing in this video, as you already probably know, there are different kinds of ways to cite things depending on what course you're taking and what discipline it's in. So for example, if you are taking a psychology course or a sociology course, they typically use what's called APA, American Psychological Association format. It looks a little different than this. The mechanics and the idea behind it is the same, but it looks slightly different. We're just going to use MLA because that's what we use for English classes. And my goal is just to have you get into the habit of citing things, including works cited. But again, for sociology, social science type classes, they typically use APA, which is slightly different than MLA. In some history courses, they use what's called Chicago manual style, which is more footnotes. I've had to use that occasionally over the years. I typically use MLA because most of what I publish, again, is in literature and in the humanities. But over the years, I've had to convert things into APA format, into Chicago style. And that's why on your directions, I'll often include that link to the OWL website at Purdue University because they have all that information. I'll show you that in another video. I don't want to do that in this one to take up too much of your time. But again, even when I'm working on articles, I don't know every single rule. So I look things up. I go to the OWL website. I have handbooks that I look at. Nobody's going to be able to memorize all of those different ways to cite things correctly. So again, if you have problems with it, if you haven't used a lot of citations or quotations in your papers before, let me know. We're going to get more practice with that as we go forward over the next couple of papers. But this handout, this kind of worksheet here, I hope will also help you. And that leads me to my last point for today in this video is do not use any sources without citing them. That's plagiarism, and I've got to give you an F if you do that. So if you get stuck with a paper, as I've said, I think from the very first video, ask me for help. I'm happy to give you suggestions. As those of you that didn't have me last semester are, I think, already seeing, I'm very quick to respond. If you send me a draft, I get back to you as quickly as I can. If I know it's gonna take me a little time to get back to you on a draft, I'll write you back immediately and say, okay, I'll get to this. If it comes in later in the day and I'm starting to close down my computer for the workday, I'm gonna get back to you the next morning. If you get it to me, in the morning, I'm gonna get it to you by the end of the day, to the best of my ability, unless I've got a bunch of quizzes or grades or papers to grade. But I'll let you know at any rate when you're going to get it back from me with comments or suggestions. So please ask me for help. If you get stuck on a topic, do not go online looking for information on that topic and then start splicing it into your paper, because if that happens, again, I'm going to have to give you an F on it, and I'm sure you know that. You've all been through 101. And I've given an example here of plagiarism. This is another one, again, from Evelyn Glennie, which is an essay I teach in 101 typically. And in this case, someone took all of this biographical information from this NPR news report on this musician, Evelyn Glennie. So they just copied it. They didn't cite it. They didn't put quotation marks around it. They just put it in there. And so if I got a paper with this in it, I'd have to give it an F, because again, what we're trying to teach you is how to cite your work properly and also how to ask for help. So if you're not sure how to do citations, if you're not sure even what quotations to include, again, more so with some of the papers we're going to do as we go on in the semester, just ask for help. Don't go online and immediately look something up and then try to put it into your paper, because it's not going to come out. It's not going to come out well, and your paper is not going to be strong to begin with. And again, I'll talk more about these issues of plagiarism and citation as we go forward. One last thing I want to mention about that here as I stop my my screen share is that citing something wrong is not plagiarism as far as I'm concerned. If you're trying to cite and you just have the format wrong, that's just something that can be corrected. All I'm asking you to do is to cite as best you can, do the best you can with the formatting. I'm not a stickler about the format, because we can correct that. As long as you're trying your best, we can make the corrections, or I can give you the suggested corrections on it. But if you're not citing at all and you're just cutting and pasting stuff in there, that's a different issue. That's plagiarism, okay? So don't do it. It's, again, it doesn't show what you can do as a writer. It's not very interesting. It never responds to the prompt, because the prompts that I give, I write myself. So they're not generic prompts that I'm finding online. So that means I'm asking you to kind of think about the work that we've been talking about in these videos, in the readings that we're doing. And I want to read your papers. Again, as I said, I don't want to read something that was cut and pasted from somebody else's online essay, okay? But anyway, let me go back to where I started from and to tell you, number one, like I said, please let me know if you have any questions on paper number one. I hope this little checklist of things to watch out for as you're working on this paper, and actually also for paper number two, which I'll be posting soon, that you'll have an idea of what to look for stylistically and grammatically. And I'll add on to this list after I've read your first batch of papers. I'll have some ideas of what else we should focus on as a group going forward over the course of the semester. All right, so I think it's probably time for me to go outside and shovel again. I'm looking out my window here near my desk in my office, and yeah, it looks like it's going to be another shoveling experience here before I have dinner. So if you have any other questions, as I said, please send me an email, let me know, and I will see you in the next video, in which I will talk about Blight, speaking of this book, and I'll talk a little bit about the elements in that story. That's one we're going to use more for paper number two, which is why I haven't really talked about that story very much yet. But I'll be doing that in the next video that I'll be posting a little bit later this week. So I will see you then. Enjoy the snow. Be careful if you're also going to go out there and shovel. Don't overdo it. Take breaks and don't hurt your back when you're shoveling, okay? See you later.